Richard Carrington had spent his entire life building walls, walls of glass and steel for his empire, walls of silence for his heart. But as he stepped into the old, crumbling orphanage that day, he had no idea that a single sentence from a little girl would shatter them all. "Hi, sir. Are you my grandpa?" The question hit him harder than any boardroom battle ever could, leaving him frozen in place. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she smiled. That smile wasn't just familiar, it was haunting. It was the smile of a ghost from his past, someone he had lost and could never forget. But before that moment, Richard's day had been like any other, devoid of warmth or surprise. The gray morning had matched his mood, as it often did. Sitting in the back of his limousine, Richard had been reading reports, his mind preoccupied with mergers and profit margins, when his assistant, Lauren, interrupted his thoughts. "There's an invitation for you, sir," Lauren said, her tone careful. She'd worked for him long enough to know that Richard Carrington wasn't easily persuaded to deviate from his rigid routines. Richard glanced at the folder she handed him. "I'm not interested in galas or charity auctions," he said, waving it off. "It's not a gala," she explained. "It's an orphanage fundraiser. They asked for you specifically, St. Mary's Orphanage." He frowned, disinterested. "Send them a check." Lauren hesitated. "They need more than money, Mr. Carrington. They need someone like you, a visible presence to attract attention to their cause." His eyes flicked to her. "Why do you care so much?" Lauren met his gaze, her voice softening. "Because sometimes it's not about what we give, it's about what we receive in return. You might find it different?" Richard sighed, closing the report. He wasn't in the mood to argue. "Fine, schedule it." That was how he found himself walking into the small, unassuming building later that afternoon. The orphanage was worlds apart from the glass towers and penthouses he was used to. The walls were lined with faded, cheerful drawings, and the air smelled faintly of cookies and crayons. Laughter echoed in the halls, and children's faces lit up as they peeked at him from around corners. He moved through the space like an outsider, his polished shoes clicking against the worn wooden floors. The director greeted him with nervous enthusiasm, offering a tour and introducing him to the children. Richard nodded politely but kept his distance, his presence imposing yet detached. The event was meant to inspire hope, but all it did was make him uncomfortable. The children's performances were charming, the speeches heartfelt, yet Richard found himself counting the minutes until he could leave. This was not his world. It never had been. But just as he turned toward the exit, ready to retreat to the safety of his solitude, a small voice called out, stopping him cold. "Hi, sir. Are you my grandpa?" It was a question so unexpected, so innocent, that it took him a moment to process. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the voice. A little girl stood there, her wide, curious eyes fixed on him. She couldn't have been more than 7, with unruly brown curls and a bright smile that made the room feel warmer. Richard blinked, trying to compose himself. "What did you say?" The girl tilted her head, unbothered by his stunned expression. "You look like my grandpa. I don't know him, but maybe it's you?" He stared at her, his heart pounding. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she looked at him, the way her smile tugged at a memory he'd tried to bury. For a moment, he was lost, transported to another time, another place. And then she held out a small locket. "My mommy gave me this. Want to see?" Richard's breath caught as he opened the locket. Inside was a faded photo of a young woman with a smile that pierced his soul. It was his daughter, Sophie, the daughter he had lost, the daughter he had failed. And now, here was this little girl, looking up at him with the same smile, the same light in her eyes. For the first time in years, Richard Carrington, the unshakable billionaire, felt his world begin to crumble. Richard stood there, frozen as the weight of the past and the present collided in that small, bustling room. The little girl looked at him expectantly, her innocent smile unwavering, while his fingers trembled slightly as they held the locket. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the photo. It was Sophie, unmistakably Sophie. The same bright eyes, the same easy smile that used to light up a room. The edges of the photo were worn, as if it had been touched countless times, carried close to someone's heart. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl shrugged in that casual way only children could. "My mommy gave it to me. She said it's special. I keep it with me all the time." "Your mommy?" Richard's voice cracked on the word. His chest tightened. The girl nodded as if she hadn't just unleashed a storm of emotions in the man standing before her. "Lila!" a voice called from across the room. It was one of the caregivers, hurrying over. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carrington," the woman said, gently taking the little girl's hand. "Lila has a vivid imagination. I hope she didn't bother you." "She wasn't bothering me," Richard said quickly, surprising himself with how firm his voice sounded. The caregiver hesitated, studying the unusual expression on his face, but before she could respond, Lila tugged at Richard's sleeve. "You didn't answer me," she said, her big brown eyes staring up at him. "Are you my grandpa?" Richard felt the room spin. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He opened his mouth, but the question lodged itself in his throat, tangled with guilt, sorrow, and disbelief. "Come on, Lila," the caregiver said softly, gently leading the girl away. "Let's not bother Mr. Carrington anymore." Lila looked back over her shoulder, her smile fading as she waved. "Bye, Grandpa." The word echoed in Richard's mind long after she disappeared into the crowd of children. For a man who prided himself on control, he suddenly felt utterly powerless. "Mr. Carrington?" It was Lauren's voice, pulling him out of his trance. She had been standing nearby, watching the exchange. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." He swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "That girl, Lila, who is she?" Lauren hesitated. "I'm not sure. I can ask the staff." "Do it," he said sharply, his tone uncharacteristically urgent. "Find out everything you can about her, her parents, her history, everything." Lauren nodded, already sensing this was more than a passing curiosity. She stepped away to make inquiries, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. As the event continued around him, Richard stood rooted to the spot, gripping the locket tightly in his hand. Memories of Sophie flooded his mind, her laughter, her fiery independence, the last argument they'd had before she walked out of his life. He had tried to reach out once, but his pride had stopped him from going further. Now, years later, standing in an orphanage surrounded by children, the reality of his failure hit him like a tidal wave. Minutes later, Lauren returned, her expression carefully neutral. "I spoke to the director. Lila's been here since she was a baby. Her mother passed away not long after she was born. They don't have much information about her father. Apparently, Lila never knew him." Richard's heart sank. "And her mother? Do they have her name?" Lauren nodded, handing him a small file. "Her name was Sophie, sir. Sophie Carrington." The name felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He opened the file with trembling hands, scanning the sparse details inside. There it was, in black and white, his daughter's name, her struggles, and her tragic end. He had been so consumed by his own world, his own pain, that he hadn't even known she was gone. For the first time in decades, Richard Carrington felt tears sting his eyes. He closed the file slowly, his jaw tightening. The room around him seemed to blur, the sounds of laughter and chatter fading into the background. All he could see was the photo in the locket and the little girl's hopeful face. She was Sophie's daughter, his granddaughter, and she had no idea who he was. Richard Carrington, the man who could move mountains in the business world, now faced the most daunting task of his life. Could he right the wrongs of the past? Could he become the family Lila had lost? He didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away. Not this time. The drive back to his penthouse felt like an eternity. Richard sat in silence, staring out of the window, though he didn't register the city passing by. His mind was consumed by the image of Lila, her bright, curious eyes, her infectious smile, and her innocent question. "Are you my grandpa?" The locket in his hand felt heavier than any responsibility he had ever carried. He turned it over and over, tracing its edges with his thumb as if it might unlock a part of Sophie's life he had missed. "Sir?" Lauren's voice broke through his thoughts. She glanced at him from the front seat, unsure if she should speak. "Are you?" "Fine," Richard said curtly, though his tone lacked its usual edge. He wasn't fine, and they both knew it. When they arrived at his penthouse, Richard stepped out of the car without another word. He didn't wait for Lauren to follow him. He needed space to think, to process. The expansive living room, with its sleek modern furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, felt colder than usual. He stood there for a moment, gripping the locket, before heading to his study. Inside, he unlocked a drawer in his desk, pulling out an old photo album he hadn't touched in years. Dust clung to its leather cover, a testament to how long it had been hidden away. Richard hesitated before opening it, bracing himself for the flood of memories it would bring. Page after page, Sophie's life unfolded before him. Her first steps, her 7th birthday party, her high school graduation, where she beamed at him, so full of pride and promise. But then came the later years, the strained smiles, the distant looks. The final photo he had of her was from the last Christmas they spent together. She had come home reluctantly, and their conversation had devolved into an argument about her choices, her independence, and his inability to let go of control. The words they had exchanged echoed in his mind now, cruel and bitter. He had pushed her away, thinking he was protecting her, when all he had done was drive her further from him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he muttered, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure who the question was for. Sophie, himself, or the universe. The next morning, Richard was at his desk, staring at the file Lauren had given him. Every detail about Sophie's life after she left him felt like a dagger to the heart. She had struggled financially, taking on multiple jobs to provide for Lila. She had been alone, without the support of family. And then there was the brief mention of her passing, an illness that took her too soon. Richard clenched his fists. How could he have let this happen? How could he have been so blind, so wrapped up in his own pride and ambition that he missed the cries for help she must have sent, even if silently? "Lauren!" he called out, his voice sharp. She entered moments later, her expression wary. "Yes, Mr. Carrington?" "I want everything, every detail about Sophie's life after she left, every person she interacted with, and find out everything about Lila, her routine, her friends, her health. I want to know it all." Lauren hesitated. "Sir, I can gather more information, but may I ask what you're planning to do?" Richard looked up at her, his face set in determination. "I don't know yet, but what I won't do is walk away. She's my granddaughter, Lauren. She's all I have left of Sophie, and I'm not going to fail her." Lauren nodded, sensing the gravity of his words. She left the room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts once again. Later that day, Richard found himself back at the orphanage, something he never would have imagined doing twice in his lifetime. The building seemed less foreign now, though no less humble. He was greeted by the director, who seemed surprised to see him. "Mr. Carrington, we weren't expecting you again so soon," she said, leading him inside. "I need to see her," Richard said simply, his voice firm but not unkind. "Lila?" The director paused, then nodded. Of course. She's in the playroom. Richard followed her down a narrow hallway. As they approached the room, the sound of children's laughter filled the air. When the door opened, he saw Lila sitting on the floor, surrounded by paper cranes she had folded. She looked up, and her face lit up with recognition. "Hi, Grandpa," she called out, her voice full of joy. Richard froze, the title still catching him off guard, but something inside him softened at the way she said it, as though it had been hers to give all along. This time, he didn't correct her. Instead, he knelt down, meeting her at eye level. "Hello, Lila," he said, his voice gentler than he'd ever heard it before. She grinned, holding up a paper crane. "Want to make one with me?" Richard hesitated, then nodded. As he sat down on the floor beside her, folding paper for the first time in decades, he realized that his journey to mend the past was just beginning. But for now, sitting with his granddaughter, it felt like the first step towards something he had thought was lost forever: family. Richard's presence at the orphanage became a regular occurrence in the days that followed. He would arrive quietly, often without warning, and spend time watching Lila from afar before gathering the courage to engage. For someone who had spent his life commanding boardrooms and shaping industries, this small, unfamiliar world felt impossibly daunting. Lila, on the other hand, welcomed him without hesitation. She would greet him with her signature smile and an enthusiastic, "Hi, Grandpa," each time he walked through the doors. Richard never corrected her. At first, he wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was because the word Grandpa softened the sharp edges of his otherwise harsh existence. Or perhaps, deep down, he wanted it to be true. One afternoon, as they sat together at a small table covered in crayons and paper, Lila leaned over her drawing and asked, "Do you have kids?" Richard hesitated. The question hit harder than he expected. "I did," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "I had a daughter." Lila looked up, her curiosity evident. "Where is she? Does she come to visit?" He swallowed the lump forming in his throat. "No," he admitted. She passed away." Lila's face fell, and for a moment she was silent. Then, in a small voice, she said, "Like my mommy." Richard nodded, his heart aching at the shared pain between them. "Yes, like your mommy." She slid her hand across the table and placed it on his, her tiny fingers wrapping around his larger ones. "I'm sorry. I miss my mommy too, but she said not to be sad because she's in a happy place now." Richard blinked back the tears threatening to spill. How could someone so young carry such wisdom and grace? "Your mommy was right," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "She would want you to be happy." "Do you think she's watching us?" Lila asked, tilting her head toward the sky. "I think she is," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I think she's proud of you." Lila beamed at that, her smile lighting up the room. "Then I'm happy." Richard sat back, overwhelmed by her resilience. It was the same resilience Sophie had always shown, even in the face of challenges that should have broken her. He saw so much of his daughter in Lila, not just in her smile, but in her strength, her warmth, and her boundless hope. Later that evening, after Lila had gone off to play with the other children, Richard found himself speaking with the orphanage director. The two stood near a window, watching Lila as she laughed and ran around the yard. "She's incredible," Richard said quietly. "Resilient, strong." "She is," the director agreed. "She's been through so much, but she's always been like that, bringing light to every room she walks into." Richard hesitated before asking, "What happens to her now? Does she stay here indefinitely?" The director sighed. "We do our best to find homes for the children, but it's not always easy, especially for those who have been here as long as Lila. Many prospective parents want younger children or specific circumstances. Richard frowned. She deserves more than this. She deserves a home, a family. The director studied him for a moment. She does, but she's also happy here. She's loved, cared for. We give her what we can, but nothing replaces a real family. Richard didn't respond immediately. He simply watched Lila, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life accumulating wealth, building an empire, and yet he had nothing to offer the one person who needed him most. At least, not yet. The next day, Lauren walked into his office, finding him deep in thought. Files and papers were spread out across his desk, all related to Lila and Sophie. "Sir?" she asked cautiously. Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. "Lauren, I need to know what it would take to adopt Lila." Lauren blinked, caught off guard. "Adopt her?" "Yes," he said firmly. "I can't change the past. I can't undo what I did to Sophie, but I can give Lila what she deserves. I can give her a family." Lauren nodded slowly, understanding the resolve in his voice. "I'll start looking into it right away." As she left, Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision settling over him. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He had no idea how to be a father, let alone a grandfather. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a spark of hope, for Sophie, for Lila, for the family he thought he had lost forever. The process of adoption turned out to be far more complicated than Richard had anticipated. Despite his wealth and influence, the system was designed to prioritize the well-being of the child, not the convenience of a potential guardian. And Lila's case, with its gaps and unanswered questions, only made things more challenging. Lauren kept him updated daily, laying out each hurdle with a tactful precision Richard both admired and resented. There were home evaluations, psychological assessments, and reviews of his background. His past, spotless on paper, carried the weight of emotional distance, a trait the agency scrutinized closely. One afternoon, as Richard reviewed yet another set of documents, Lauren entered his office with a hesitant expression. "They've raised a concern," she said, placing a file on his desk. "What kind of concern?" he asked, his voice sharp. Lauren sighed. "They're questioning whether you can provide the emotional support Lila needs. Given your history, they're worried you may not have the experience to connect with her on the level she requires." Richard's jaw tightened. "My history? You mean my career? My success? The fact that I've worked harder than anyone else to achieve everything I have?" "They don't see it that way," Lauren replied carefully. "To them, it looks like you've spent your life prioritizing work over relationships. They think Lila might be better off with someone warmer." The words stung in a way Richard hadn't anticipated. "I'm her grandfather," he said firmly. "She's my family. That should count for something." Lauren nodded. "It does, but they're looking at what's best for her long term. They need to be sure you're not just doing this out of guilt or obligation." Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Was that how they saw him? A guilt-ridden billionaire trying to soothe his conscience with a grand gesture? Did they think he was incapable of giving Lila the love she deserved? "Set up the next meeting," he said after a long silence. "I'll convince them." Lauren hesitated. "Sir, it's not just about convincing them. It's about showing them who you are, the real you." Richard's gaze softened, and for once he didn't have a ready retort. He simply nodded. The next time Richard visited the orphanage, it was raining. The sky was a deep, unrelenting gray, the kind that seemed to absorb sound and light. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat, and found Lila sitting by the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. When she saw him, her face lit up. "Grandpa, you're here!" Richard couldn't help but smile. "I'm here," he said, kneeling down to her level. "What are you doing?" She pointed to the window. "I'm making wishes on the raindrops. If you pick the fastest one and it wins, your wish comes true." "Is that so?" he asked, sitting beside her. "What are you wishing for?" Lila turned to him, her expression earnest. "I wish for a family, a real family, like the ones in the stories." Richard felt a pang in his chest. And what would this family look like? She thought for a moment, then smiled. A mommy and a daddy, or a grandpa, someone who tells stories and tucks me in at night, someone who stays. The simplicity of her wish shattered him. For all the wealth he had accumulated, for all the power he wielded, he had never considered what it meant to truly stay for someone. "Well," he said quietly, "what if I told you that you already have a grandpa, and he's trying very hard to make sure he can stay with you?" Lila's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" Richard nodded, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to surface. "Really?" Lila threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "Then I already got my wish," she whispered. In that moment, Richard realized that no boardroom negotiation, no business deal, had ever mattered as much as this. He had spent his life building an empire, but here, in this small orphanage, he had found something far more valuable, a chance to love and be loved. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, interviews, and evaluations. Richard poured himself into the process, determined to prove that he could be the grandfather Lila needed. He attended parenting classes, met with counselors, and even opened up about his past mistakes, a vulnerability that didn't come easily to him. But through it all, he thought of Lila, her laughter, her resilience, her unwavering belief in him. She was his anchor, his reason to fight. Finally, the day came when the adoption agency called with their decision. Richard sat in his office, the phone pressed to his ear, as the caseworker delivered the news. "Mr. Carrington, after reviewing your case, we've decided to approve your adoption of Lila." Congratulations! For the first time in years, Richard felt a genuine, unrestrained smile spread across his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." When he arrived at the orphanage later that day, Lila ran to him, her arms outstretched. "Grandpa!" she cried, her voice full of joy. He caught her in his arms, holding her close. "I'm here, Lila," he said softly, "and I'm never leaving." The morning of Lila's move to her new home dawned bright and crisp, with the kind of sunlight that hinted at new beginnings. The staff at the orphanage bustled around, helping her pack her belongings into a small suitcase. It was a bittersweet day for them. While they were thrilled for Lila, her absence would leave a noticeable void. Richard arrived promptly, dressed in a casual sweater and slacks that Lauren had suggested, a deliberate effort to seem more approachable. His usual air of detachment had softened over the past weeks, replaced by something gentler, warmer. He walked into the playroom where Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, folding a final paper crane. "Ready, kiddo?" he asked, his voice lighter than usual. Lila looked up and grinned. "Almost. This one's for the wishing wall." "The wishing wall?" Richard asked, tilting his head. She pointed to a bulletin board covered in colorful paper cranes. "We put our wishes here so they don't get lost," she explained. Carefully, she added her crane to the collection, then turned back to him. "Okay, now I'm ready." The staff gathered to see them off, their faces a mix of smiles and tears. The director knelt in front of Lila, hugging her tightly. "Be good, sweetheart," she whispered. "And remember, you'll always have a family here." Lila nodded, her smile unwavering. "I know. But now I have a grandpa too." Richard cleared his throat, the lump forming there harder to swallow than he'd expected. He extended his hand to Lila, and she took it eagerly, her small fingers fitting perfectly in his. Together, they walked out of the orphanage, stepping into a car that would take them toward a new chapter. The ride to Richard's home was filled with Lila's endless chatter. She pointed out every interesting sight from the car window, her excitement bubbling over. Richard listened attentively, marveling at how easily she brought life to even the simplest observations. When they finally arrived at the towering building where Richard lived, Lila's eyes widened. "This is your house?" she asked, craning her neck to take it all in. "Our house," Richard corrected gently. As they stepped into the elevator, Lila pressed her face against the glass, watching the city fall away as they ascended. When the doors opened to his penthouse, she let out a gasp of delight. The space, sleek and modern, felt entirely new to her. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city, and the luxurious furnishings seemed almost otherworldly. "It's so big," Lila exclaimed, running to the windows. "You can see everything from here." Richard followed her, watching her eyes light up as she took in the view. "It's different from the orphanage, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded. "It's like living in the sky." "Well," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "it's your sky now." Lila's smile faltered for the first time as she turned to face him. "But where's my room?" Richard hesitated. "Right this way," he said, leading her down a hallway. He pushed open a door to reveal a bedroom that had been decorated with care. A small bed with soft pink sheets, shelves filled with books and toys, and a desk by the window. Lila stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. "You made this for me?" Richard nodded. "It's yours. I wanted you to feel at home here." For a moment she didn't move. Then she ran to him and threw her arms around his waist. "Thank you, Grandpa," she whispered. "I've never had my own room before." Richard's chest tightened as he wrapped his arms around her. "You deserve it, Lila. You deserve everything." The days that followed were a learning curve for both of them. Richard quickly realized that raising a child required more than material comforts. He learned how to braid Lila's hair after she asked for pigtails one morning, much to his initial confusion and later triumph. He spent evenings reading her stories, fumbling over the voices she insisted he attempt for each character. And he discovered the joy of simply sitting beside her, folding paper cranes, as she chattered about her day. For Lila, the adjustment was seamless. She brought warmth and energy into the penthouse, filling the quiet spaces with laughter and curiosity. She asked Richard endless questions about his life, his work, and his memories of Sophie. Each answer brought them closer, slowly knitting together the threads of their shared history. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights, Lila turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Grandpa, do you think Mommy's happy now?" Richard looked at her, his heart aching with both love and regret. "I think she's very happy," he said. "I think she's watching us and smiling because she knows you're safe and loved." Lila nodded, satisfied with his answer. She leaned her head against his arm, and for the first time in years, Richard felt truly at peace. Over time, Richard found himself transforming in ways he hadn't anticipated. The once untouchable billionaire had become a grandfather, a real one. He laughed more, smiled more, and found joy in the small, everyday moments he once overlooked. And for Lila, the world finally felt like a safe place. She had found her family, her home, and a love that promised to stay. As they folded their last paper crane that evening, Lila looked up at him with her mother's smile and said, "Mommy would be happy." Richard nodded, his own smile soft and full of gratitude. "Yes, she would, and so am I." As the months passed, Richard and Lila settled into a rhythm that felt natural, as though they had always been a part of each other's lives. The penthouse no longer felt like a cold fortress in the sky. Lila's presence had transformed it into a home, filling the once empty spaces with laughter, warmth, and color. Richard, a man who had spent decades mastering the art of business, found himself learning entirely new skills. He became an expert at packing school lunches, learned the subtle art of comforting a child after a bad dream, and even discovered the simple joy of watching Saturday morning cartoons. His days, once rigidly structured and focused on profits, were now punctuated by impromptu tea parties and board games that Lila insisted on winning. But not everything was easy. Richard struggled to balance his work life with his newfound role as a full-time grandfather. Late nights in his home office became more frequent, and he often found himself torn between closing important deals and making it home in time for Lila's bedtime stories. One evening, as Richard typed away at his desk, Lila appeared in the doorway, clutching a stuffed bunny. "Grandpa?" she asked softly, her voice laced with hesitation. He looked up, his fingers pausing mid-keystroke. "What is it, sweetheart?" She shuffled her feet, avoiding his gaze. "You promised to read me a story tonight, but you didn't come." Richard's chest tightened with guilt. He glanced at the clock. It was well past her bedtime. "I'm sorry, Lila," he said, rising from his chair. "I got caught up in work. Let me read to you now." But Lila shook her head. "It's okay. Maybe tomorrow." She turned and walked back to her room, her steps slow and quiet. Richard stood there, frozen by the weight of his own disappointment. He had spent years prioritizing work over relationships, and now he was on the brink of repeating the same mistake. The next morning, Richard made a decision. Over breakfast, as Lila munched on pancakes, he cleared his throat. "Lila," he began, "I've been thinking. I want to spend more time with you." She looked up, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Really?" "Really?" he said with a nod. "So I'm going to take a step back from work. I'll still go to the office sometimes, but I won't let it take over my life. You're what's most important." Lila's face lit up, and she leapt from her chair to hug him tightly. "Does this mean we can have more movie nights?" Richard chuckled, ruffling her hair. "As many as you want." True to his word, Richard scaled back his commitments, delegating more responsibilities to his trusted team. With his newfound freedom, he and Lila embarked on a series of adventures. They visited museums, explored parks, and even took a weekend trip to the countryside, where Lila discovered a love for horses. Each day was a reminder to Richard of how much he had missed during Sophie's childhood, and how determined he was not to make the same mistakes again. One crisp autumn afternoon, Richard and Lila visited Sophie's grave for the first time together. The cemetery was quiet, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. Lila held Richard's hand tightly as they approached the gravestone, her other hand clutching a bouquet of daisies. Kneeling by the grave, Lila placed the flowers gently on the stone. "Hi, Mommy," she said softly. "It's me, Lila. I'm doing okay now. Grandpa's taking care of me." Richard stood behind her, his heart heavy with emotion. He rested a hand on her shoulder, his voice thick as he spoke. "Sophie, I'm sorry. For everything. For not being there when you needed me. But I promise I'll make it right. I'll take care of Lila. I'll give her the love and support you deserved." Lila turned to him and smiled. "She's listening, Grandpa. I know she is." They stood there together, the weight of the past slowly lifting as the promise of the future settled between them. As the seasons changed, so did Richard and Lila's lives. Their bond grew stronger, built on trust, love, and the shared memory of the woman who had brought them together. Richard discovered a new purpose, dedicating part of his wealth to supporting orphanages like the one that had cared for Lila. His transformation was profound, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own heart. One evening, as they folded paper cranes by the fireplace, Lila looked up at him with her mother's familiar smile. "Grandpa, do you think Mommy would be proud of us?" Richard's throat tightened, and he nodded. "I think she'd be very proud of both of us." Lila leaned against him, her voice soft. "Then I'm happy." As the fire crackled and the cranes piled up on the table, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a deep, unshakable peace. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, but in the end, it was this, a little girl's love, a second chance at family that had truly made him whole. As time went on, Richard and Lila found themselves creating traditions that became the foundation of their new life together. Saturday mornings were dedicated to pancakes. Lila insisted on adding chocolate chips, claiming they made the pancakes extra magical. Afternoons were spent at the park, where Lila made friends easily, and Richard became known to the other parents and grandparents as Lila's grandpa, a title he carried with increasing pride. But their favorite tradition was folding paper cranes in the evenings, a quiet activity that had become their special time together. Each crane held a wish, a hope, or a memory. The cranes began to fill jars and baskets around the house, a colorful reminder of their shared journey. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace with paper spread out between them, Lila asked a question that caught Richard off guard. "Grandpa," she said, carefully creasing a fold, "do you think Mommy ever made wishes?" Richard paused, the paper crane in his hands forgotten. "I think she did," he said slowly. Sophie was full of dreams and hopes. She always wanted the world to be a kinder place. "What do you think she wished for?" Lila pressed, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. He thought for a moment, memories of Sophie flashing through his mind, her laughter, her determination, her love for life. "I think she wished for your happiness," he said finally. "She would have wanted you to grow up surrounded by love." Lila nodded thoughtfully, setting down her crane. "I think her wish came true." Richard's heart swelled at her words, and he reached out to ruffle her hair. "I think it did, too." But one day, Richard received an invitation from St. Mary's Orphanage for a special event. They were hosting a fundraiser to expand their facilities, and they wanted him and Lila to attend as guests of honor. The director explained how Richard's newfound support and generosity had inspired other donors, transforming the orphanage into a beacon of hope for the community. When Richard told Lila about the invitation, she squealed with excitement. "We have to go, Grandpa. I want to see everyone." The night of the event, Richard and Lila arrived at the orphanage hand in hand. The once fading building now gleamed with fresh paint, new windows, and a playground filled with laughter. Lila ran ahead, greeting the staff and children with hugs and excitement. Richard followed, his chest tightening with pride as he watched her light up the room. During the event, the director took the stage to thank the donors, highlighting Richard's contributions. When she invited him to speak, Richard hesitated. Public speaking was second nature to him, but this moment felt different, more personal. As he stepped to the podium, he glanced at Lila, who stood nearby, beaming up at him. He cleared his throat, the room falling silent. "I came to this orphanage months ago as a stranger," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't know what to expect. What I found here wasn't just an institution, it was a home that cared for the people who needed it most, including my granddaughter, Lila." The audience murmured softly, touched by his words. "Lila showed me something I had forgotten," Richard continued. "She reminded me that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, patience, and the willingness to be there for one another, no matter what. And because of her, I've learned that it's never too late to find your purpose, or to become the person you were meant to be." Applause filled the room, and Richard stepped down, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Lila ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "You were amazing, Grandpa," she said, her eyes shining. "So were you, kiddo," he replied, lifting her into his arms. The event marked a turning point, not just for the orphanage, but for Richard as well. He continued his efforts to support children in need, using his wealth and influence to create opportunities for those who might otherwise be overlooked. He and Lila made regular visits to St. Mary's, offering their time and presence as much as their resources. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Lila turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Grandpa, do you think we'll ever run out of wishes?" Richard smiled, pulling a paper crane from his pocket. "I don't think so, Lila. As long as we have each other, there will always be more wishes to make." Lila grinned, folding her own crane and placing it beside his. "Then let's make 1,000,000 of them." And they did. Together they filled their lives with cranes, wishes, and memories, creating a legacy of love that neither of them had ever imagined. For Richard, the journey that began with guilt and loss had transformed into a story of redemption and hope. And for Lila, the little girl who once longed for a family, life had become a series of joyful moments wrapped in the unbreakable bond of a grandfather's love. As the sun set that evening, casting a warm golden glow over them, Lila leaned her head against Richard's shoulder and whispered, "Mommy would be proud of us." Richard nodded, his voice soft but certain. "She would, Lila. She would." As the years rolled on, Richard and Lila's bond deepened, each day layering new memories over the ones they had already built. Lila blossomed into a confident, compassionate young girl, her bright smile and boundless energy bringing joy to everyone she met. And Richard, once a man defined by ambition and solitude, found himself thriving in the role of grandfather, mentor, and protector. But life, as Richard had learned, rarely moved in a straight line. One afternoon, Lila came home from school unusually quiet. She set her backpack down and went straight to her room without her usual burst of chatter. Richard noticed immediately and followed her. "Lila?" he called softly, knocking on her door. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" After a moment, she opened the door, her eyes red and watery. "Grandpa," she said in a shaky voice, "we had a family day at school. Everyone brought their moms and dads. I was the only one who didn't have a mom. Or a dad." Richard's heart sank as he knelt before her. "Oh, Lila, I'm so sorry you felt alone today." She wiped her eyes, sniffling. "I know I have you, but sometimes I just wish Mommy was here too." Richard pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "I know, Lila. I miss her too, every day." For the first time in a long while, the absence of Sophie loomed between them, a shared ache they both carried. Richard knew he couldn't fill that void completely, but he could show Lila that their family, however unconventional, was strong and unshakable. "I'll tell you what," he said gently. "How about we make a special project for your next family day? Something that shows everyone how much love we have in our family, even if it looks a little different." Lila's teary eyes lit up. "Like what?" Richard smiled, an idea already forming. "You'll see, but it's going to take some work and a whole lot of paper cranes." Over the next few weeks, Richard and Lila dedicated their evenings to the project. Together, they folded hundreds of colorful paper cranes, each one carrying a wish, a memory, or a message of love. They strung them together into garlands, creating a vibrant, moving display that represented their family's journey. The night before Family Day, Richard sat with Lila in her room, carefully attaching the last crane to the garland. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Lila asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Richard looked at her, his eyes warm. "Lila, it's more than enough. This isn't just a project, it's our story, and it's one I'm proud of." The next day, when they arrived at school, Lila carried the garland into the classroom, her steps hesitant but determined. The other children looked on in awe as she and Richard worked together to hang the cranes, transforming the space into a kaleidoscope of color. "This is my family," Lila said proudly when it was her turn to present. "It's just me and my grandpa, but we've made so many wishes together that I think we're the luckiest family in the world." Her words were met with applause, and as Richard watched her beam with confidence, he felt an overwhelming sense of pride. He had spent much of his life chasing success, but this, being Lila's family, was his greatest achievement. Over time, the story of Richard and Lila became an inspiration to others. Their paper cranes became a symbol of hope and resilience, featured in community projects, and even displayed at St. Mary's Orphanage as a testament to the power of second chances. As Lila grew older, she carried the lessons of her unique childhood with her, becoming a voice for children who longed for love and belonging. And Richard, now retired, dedicated his time to supporting families and children in need, ensuring that no child would feel the loneliness Lila once had. One evening, years later, Lila, now a young woman, sat with Richard on the balcony of their home. The city lights sparkled in the distance, and the air was filled with the faint rustle of paper cranes hanging nearby. "You've given me everything, Grandpa," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Not just a home, but a family, and a reason to believe in myself." Richard smiled, his hand resting on hers. "And you've given me a second chance, Lila. A chance to be the kind of person Sophie always believed I could be." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared journey settling into something lighter, something peaceful. The cranes swayed gently in the breeze, each one a testament to their love, their struggles, and the family they had built together. And as the stars twinkled above, Richard felt Sophie's presence, a quiet warmth that told him she was watching and she was proud.